The U.S. presidential election is on November 5th, and all eyes are on the 7 so-called battleground states that are expected to determine the outcome of the voting. And October 24th marks World Polio Day, a day dedicated to raising awareness about the fight against polio, a potentially debilitating disease that affects children worldwide. All this and much more coming up on today's Africa 54. The U.S. presidential election is on November 5th, and all eyes are on the 7 so-called battleground states that are expected to determine the outcome of the 2024 election. The western swing state of Nevada does not lean strongly toward one major party or the other. VOA's Dora McCoy reports from Las Vegas.
Nevada, home to 3.1 million people, is probably best known for Las Vegas, its most famous city, also known as Sin City.
But they're a bit of a paradox. I mean, they're seen as perhaps a liberal state in some sense because it was the first state that really pushed no-fault divorce. It has gambling in certain counties. It allows prostitution. But it also has this undercurrent of being very, very conservative in some respects.
Nevada reliably voted Republican from the late 1960s until the early 2000s. Since then, the state regularly swings between the two political parties. Nevada's population has more than tripled since 1980. Many recent newcomers are from predominantly liberal California.
What's happened is the Clark County, which is the county where Las Vegas sits, is now 72% of the voting population in this state. So what has happened to Nevada is what was once a rural Mountain West state has become an urban West Coast state.
There's Vegas, and then there's the rest of Nevada. And from my knowledge, Vegas tends to be more on the Democrat side, whereas the rest of Nevada is more Republican. But then again, most of the population is in Vegas.
Despite the population explosion, Nevada remains heavily working class, with many residents working manual jobs.
So things like wages, things like unemployment, things like housing affordability, just inflation in general, so things like fuel prices, all of those things affect people a little bit more here in Nevada than they might in some other states.
College students at the University of Nevada at Las Vegas outline their top issues. Some will vote for the first time now that they've reached the voting age of 18.
Definitely abortion, definitely the economy. What else? Education as well.
The state of the economy, probably just the border.
I'm kind of broke college kid. I would just like to be able to better afford food. I would like to be able to have a single job that pays enough to help me with all of my needs.
When they vote in November's general election, Nevadans will also vote on whether to install a right to abortion in the state constitution.
The issue overall has already proven to be a big driver, a big motivator of turnout in prior elections, and I think this one will be no different.
Still, Miller says no one should underestimate former President Donald Trump's chances of winning Nevada.
I think that Trump is being perceived as a candidate unlikely to win Nevada simply because he hasn't won the last 2 times. I wouldn't discount the importance of economic issues as driving the decision for voters in this state.
Good evening, Nevada!
Nevada's critical role as a battleground state is why both presidential nominees, Trump and Vice President Kamala Harris, are spending time here. Because ultimately, what happens in Vegas could determine who will lead America for the next 4 years.
You're fired! Get out of here! You're fired!
Dora McCoy, VOA News, Las Vegas.
As the U.S. presidential election nears, American students living in Senegal are closely watching the campaign, with some saying their experiences in Africa shape how they view events in the United States. Reporter Wahane Johnson Sambu met with a group of American students in Dakar and spoke to 3 of them in this report narrated by Azuma Compaore.
The US presidential election is generating excitement among some American students living in Senegal, and despite being far from home, they say they remain interested in what's happening back home. Bridget Brown, a 22-year-old American student, says that living in Senegal doesn't affect her perspective as a US voter. Instead, she feels that the distance allows her to more clearly assess which candidate is best suited for the role.
I think being here, it makes me realize how important it is that we have a president that cares about other countries, other cultures, other traditions, and especially in Africa, it's so important that we have kind of our best foot forward when we're engaging with other countries. So for me, I'm looking for a candidate that feels that way and kind of supports those ideas and will be kind of our best representation of the United States abroad.
Madeline Luther, a 20-year-old student, says she closely follows the debates and key issues raised by both candidates, former President Donald Trump and Vice President Kamala Harris. While living in Africa hasn't changed her perception of the election or her expectations as a voter, she says that the perspectives of others around her do have an impact.
Oh, it definitely could have an impact, but I wouldn't say yet that it's absolutely going to. I think anything anybody says, whether they're Senegalese or whether they're American, impacts the way that I think about things and changes the way that I might vote. Take into account everything that everybody says and what people think here about the candidates as well.
Eli Conrad Wolfsha, a 21-year-old student, says that while he is closely following the US elections, his involvement is limited.
Aux États-Unis, je fais beaucoup d'interactions avec les campagnes électorales.
In the United States, I do a lot of interactions during the election campaign. Since I was very young, I worked for a lot of candidates, especially at the national level, but also at the state level. Here, I can't do that work, so I'm not very involved in the elections. But I watch and read the news every day to know what's happening in the United States, to be informed as possible before the election.
Pour que je sache qu'est-ce qui se passe aux États-Unis et pour que je puisse être le plus informé avant l'élection.
Regardless of their political affiliations, these three young American students living in Senegal expressed a strong sense of responsibility in the upcoming US presidential election and a concern for the nation's role on the global stage. For Wahani Johnson Sambu in Dakar, Senegal, Arzuma Kampaure, VOA Africa.
Let's turn our attention now to women making a difference in their communities. Today, we introduce you to Hazel Olithia Miscellany, a Malawian lawyer dedicated to representing children and women in criminal and civil cases in some of Malawi's remote areas. Hazel joins us now from Blantyre, Malawi. Hazel, welcome to Africa 54. Tell us what inspired you to become a lawyer in the first place.
Thank you very much for having me today. So what inspired me to become a lawyer? Honestly, I think it's the usual cliche. I wanted to become a doctor, couldn't qualify, couldn't do math. But I've always had a passion for, what is right and what is wrong. And I've never liked bullies. So I think it's something that really propelled me down this career path. And honestly, since I've been immersed in the law, it's been rewarding and I love it. And I'm constantly talking about it and always trying to inspire young girls and women to join this profession.
Now, what led you to the decision to represent women and children specifically in civil cases?
Well, when I first started my career in Malawi, I'd say I was stationed with the Legal Aid Bureau, and I was positioned in the north, one of the most rural areas. And there I was the only female practicing lawyer. And at the time, they would always refer the cases to me, cases for women, cases for children. But what I quickly realized was that there was a knowledge gap where there was no specialized legal representation for women and for children, something that's child-centric something that's gender centric. And so that really made me want to become the best lawyer in terms of gender and child's rights. And I've managed to do that. I believe I've sought knowledge. I've gone for my master's in children's rights. I've engaged myself in so many projects. And so when the opportunity came to be a fellow under the Waging Justice for Women Fellow under the Cooney Foundation Justice, I really jumped onto that, not only because of what the Cooney Foundation is, but also the organization that would host the fellow in Malawi, so that being Women Lawyers Association, that have come out so strongly on so many issues concerning women and children in Malawi. For me, it just felt like the right decision, the right place to be. And we've done a lot in terms of, protecting and promoting those rights of women and girls in this country.
Hazel, I understand you also run legal clinics. Now, what's the most important lesson that you want people to learn when they come to those legal clinics about the law and how they can be represented without necessarily having to pay for their legal fees?
Well, I feel like you've actually summed it up. But I think the biggest thing for me is that when we go to these legal clinics, we go to some of the most rural areas in Malawi, some of the most underserved areas, hard to reach. And these are places where people don't even know that they actually have rights. So for me, the biggest thing is to really tell people that, look, you have the right to be recognized before the law. And because you have that right, you can enforce certain rights, and you really do matter. It's really bringing down this message. It's really about legal literacy. It's really about empowerment, especially for the women and the girls. It's no secret that Malawi is one of the poorest countries in the world, and it's on every scale. And literacy is a big thing. Empowerment is also a big thing. So if we're going to talk about tackling gender-based violence, we really need to empower these people. And so for me, the biggest thing right now, those legal clinics matter so much in this fight against gender-based violence, because we need to get to those people. They need to know that they matter.
And very quickly, Hazel, do you recall a case that was very challenging for you to win in the court?
Oh, yeah, several. But I think the biggest one that has stuck with me is it's a case that we were trying to navigate both the criminal system and also the civil system. It was a lady who had been charged for deserting a 2-week-old baby at the biological baby's father's place of work. A little bit of context, the man basically had abandoned her and was refusing to recognize the child and give this woman any assistance. Out of desperation, she left the child in his office to say, look, I can't manage to look after this child, you can. And he had this woman arrested. And I think what stood out for me in particular was that you really saw the patriarchy coming together to punish this woman, through the criminal law. And this was a legal provision that was being used to oppress this woman. So we were able to have those charges leveled against her taken away. She was discharged, she was acquitted. And then we turned the tables around and we sought maintenance from him. And we've been able to secure that, and we're sure that he will be paying. Wow. So yeah, it was one of those cases, and one of the first cases that I actually did with women lawyers as well. So that really stood out for me.
Hazel, thank you so much for your service to the people of Malawi. Olithia Micheleni is a Malawian lawyer. October 24th marks World Polio Day, a day dedicated to raising awareness about the fight against polio. The World Health Organization says polio cases have decreased by over 99% since 1988. Pakistan and Afghanistan are the last 2 countries in the world that are polio endemic. Dr. Tunji Funsho, Chairman, Nigeria National Polio Plus Committee of Rotary International, tells Africa 54 health correspondent Lino Mudu that despite progress, the threat of polio remains and continued vigilance is essential.
The cooperation of governments all across Africa and all across the world really has contributed immensely to ensure that we reach all children who are vulnerable with the polio vaccine. The second thing, of course, is our partners who have the expertise, WHO and UNICEF, the Gates Foundation, the CDC in Atlanta, and the Gavi Foundation have contributed immensely to the success of the program right across the world. In Nigeria in particular, we've had tremendous, government buy-in. In most African countries, have done that since my revered Nelson Mandela, came out with the cry of kick polio out of Africa.
While Africa is polio-free, some countries have reported a new reinfection of circulating vaccine-derived poliovirus. Is vaccine-derived polio impacting the global fight against polio?
The vaccine-derived virus is a product of the attenuated virus in the oral polio vaccine. We have two types of polio vaccine, the injectable type. Then we have the oral polio vaccine. The wild polio virus is much more difficult to contain as compared to the circulating vaccine-derived. We have had quite a number of countries in the last couple of years where we have been able to put the lead on the circulation of the vaccine-derived. So the strategies are much easier, they're much simpler. Unfortunately, we face challenges, insecurity, and conflict, which is what has led to the festering of the circulating vaccine-derived. So the classification is such that while poliovirus is our main objective, we have confidence, because we have done it in recent years, in putting a lead on circulating vaccine-derived poliovirus, quite quickly. The message on World Polio Day this year is that the job is not done, and we'll continue to need all hands on deck to ensure that those two precious drops of the oral polio vaccine reaches every child on the planet.
The World Health Organization says the global polio program will increasingly focus on eliminating the risk of wild polio virus. Thursday is the final day of the annual meetings of the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank Group. Financial executives and representatives from civil society organizations and academics are gathered here in Washington to discuss issues of global concern. Standing by live at the meetings is VOA's Philip Alexiou. Philip, what is IMF saying about inflation?
Nice to see you, Esther. I'm sandwiched between the IMF and the World Bank behind me. So let's take a look at inflation, as you mentioned. So Pierre-Olivier Goronchas, the Director of Research Department at the IMF, he's pointing out that inflation 2 years ago was 9.4%, and it's falling to 3.5% by the end of next year. And in most of the countries, inflation's hovering close to what the central banks like. So that's a good thing. And so the other thing is that inflation had come down while the global economy remained, they use the word resilient. But the two biggest economies, the United States and China, have been cooling, but over in Asia has been quite robust. But the problem is with the low-income countries where they've seen their growth sort of now revised downward, and that's not good. And that's because of a variety of things, obviously because of conflicts going on in these countries and also the climate shocks. Now, the decline in inflation without a global recession, according to Goronchas, is a major achievement. So that's been a good thing. That's been big. And a lot of that's because of the monetary policy that's played a decisive role in that.
Oh, and Philip, how about in Southern Africa? I mean, Sub-Saharan Africa. What is the inflation situation like there?
Yeah, so good point. So, of course, Africa, such a diverse continent, but in Sub-Saharan Africa, the regional growth rates there, while they've sort of been steady, they should go up about 0.5% next year to about 4.3%. But the problem is, in these areas in Sub-Saharan Africa, growth is very elusive. You've got these huge debt crises in some of these countries who have to deal with food and climate and poverty crises. And when you have double-digit inflation on top of these things, and that's also happening in the Middle East as well, you have a lot of soaring prices. Inflation as high as 158%. Egypt's at 36%. Sierra Leone at 34%. Now, if you look at Ghana, where they've made some restructuring deals with the IMF, they've gone from 40% inflation to 19% and should be 12% next year. And Kenya has come down from 6.3 to 5.5. But the IMF director, who Vincent Makori spoke with earlier this week, Catalina Georgieva, was talking about adding a member to Sub-Saharan Africa to the board. And that's going to be happening next month. for more representation. She's wanting more representation in Africa, and she's particularly wanting women. She's pushing for women, and we can expect to hear more from her about that going forward, that they're a great resource, she says. But the problem now with trying to correct any countries that are having their issues, you have these elevated debt levels, the interest rates are high, and this is according to Garanchas, the lead economist for the IMF. Things escalate very quickly when you have all of these factors involved. And what happens is things can get out of control. So his point is you have to bring things under control with monetary policy, because if you don't have any fiscal buffers to handle emergencies, and you have any cash for anything else that you might need in any of these countries, then you become at the mercy of the markets. And if that happens, then you're in trouble, because then you're forced to start adjusting your economies because you've been at the mercy of the markets telling you what you need to do.
Right, Philip.
But you can't move too quickly either. So it's a balancing act.
A balancing act indeed, Philip. We'll see what happens, especially with debt cancellation for African countries. Philip Alexio reporting live for us from the IMF World Bank meetings right here in Washington, D.C. Still to come, Zambia celebrates 60 years of independence. We'll be right back.
Women are leading change for a safe and prosperous Sahel. That's according to the UNDP, the United Nations Development Program. However, UNDP notes that women also continue to face numerous challenges stemming from deeply ingrained social cultural norms and structural barriers. On this week's episode of Our Voices, we hear about their journeys and what experts say they can do for greater gains when fighting for peace and security on the continent. Join the conversation each week right here on Our Voices.
In other news, the office of Nigerian President Bola Tinubu says he has fired 5 ministers and appointed 7 new ones in a major cabinet shakeup. His office says it's aimed at making his administration more efficient. The reshuffle comes amid citizens' frustration with the administration over the rising cost of living. And Human Rights Watch is calling out the government of Burkina Faso for failing to include human rights violations taking place in the country in a report to the African Commission on Human and People's Rights. Burkinabe authorities, security forces and terror groups are all accused of widespread abuses against civilians and restrictions on people's rights and freedoms. 60 years ago today, Zambia gained its independence from British rule and began supporting other African liberation movements. To learn more about Zambia's contributions, VOA's Paul Ndiho spoke with Sombo Muzata, the director of the MPA program and an assistant professor in the Department of Political Science at James Madison University.
Zambia turns 60. It's a day of great celebration, but it is also a day of reflection. So independence, of course, means freeing ourselves, so freeing the Black people in Zambia from minority white rule. 2024 happens to be the year in which Kenneth Kaunda turns 100 years old. He was a visionary leader, and I think that few leaders today or in the past could match up to the kind of ideals and values that he stood for. So Zambia supported many countries across the continent because we were a member of the Liberation Movement Committee. And that committee, I think, was founded in 62 or 63, and Zambia was a member of that. We supported, I think, Tanzania. Tanzania got independence earlier than us, but Zambia supported Tanzania with their independence struggle, providing logistical support and as a base for some of their people. We supported South Africa. That's like an open secret. Even when Nelson Mandela came out of prison, the first country that he visited was Zambia. We played a very, very critical role in their independence struggle over there, fighting apartheid. We also supported Namibia with their fight for liberation. So I think we did play a very critical role in the countries that surround us. And I think that has to be commended. It's something that we have to celebrate. Kenneth Kaunda had in his mind that Africa will not be free, or Zambia will not be free until every other country is free. So with that kind of philosophical underpinning, we can see that he put his all in this fight for liberation of other countries.
Fascinating stuff. It's interesting that you say that Kenneth Kaunda had the vision of saying that Africa will not be free until everyone is free. It looks like that was the rallying cause for all these freedom fighters back in the day. You look at the likes of Kwame Nkrumah, you go down to Kenneth Kaunda, Milton Obote, Abdel Nasser, all those guys who had like the same vision. But today, you can almost count on your fingers how many leaders are like that.
It's really sad that the fabric of Pan-Africanism has totally waned off, or I would say totally waned off, actually. There is this idea of every country for themselves and God for us all. And I think that that is problematic in itself.
What does 60 years of independence mean to an ordinary woman on the street, an ordinary woman in Chipata, where you come from?
Most are going to be celebrating because it's an occasion worth celebrating. If you were born post-independence like me, you probably grew up in a Zambia where Independence Day was a very big celebration. I still, would like to see many women in Chipata, where I grew up, to get excited about this moment and to be thankful for the peace that we have had. We are the beacon of peace on the African continent. And also to be hopeful because there's a lot more that the country is going to be able to attain.
That was Sombo Mzata, the director of the MPA program and assistant professor in the Department of Political Science at James Madison University, speaking to VOA's Paul Ndiho. And that's our show for today. Be sure to watch Africa 54 on our website at voaafrica.com. From all of us here in Washington, thanks for watching.